Hey, Juan. Hey, Juan.
Hello?
Howdy.
Hello.
It's Tuesday and it feels a whole lot like Monday, which is sort of disappointing.
Mike, sorry to hear about the broken finger.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, playing rugby
Ooh,
over the
ow.
weekend. Thankfully, it doesn't hurt too much, so I'm getting it checked out later today.
If you're going to break a finger, you have to break your middle finger.
It's my ring finger, so close.
Because then when you flick your boss off, you could just be like, I can't help it, man. Sorry. Tough crowd. Okay, going back on mute.
I think
No,
we'll.
I learned that if you blur your background, like in some I don't know, in either Zoom or in Google Meet or whatever, it doesn't matter what finger you raise up. It's gonna make it look like you're showing the middle finger. So don't do that.
That there is gold.
All right, and with that, welcome everyone to the Tuesday, April 30th, 2024 SIG Multicluster meeting. It looks like we have Arthur up first. Arthur?
We can't really hear you.
Do we have Arthur here? Oh, there we go. Okay, then Corentin and Mike, we'll start with you while Arthur sorts out mic issues.
Mike, go for it. I just put it on the agenda. I just wanted to make sure I was there.
Oh no, okay. I am going to share my screen now. I was actually hoping you share the screen. Well, that's okay. Let me share my screen.
I can do some of it if you want. I mean,
No, it's okay.
You wrote it, so I mean, I'm not stealing thunder here.
Let me go here. All right. Okay, a quick shout out first of all. I'll meet. I will in maybe like the first week of this repo was created and talk about cluster inventory API. I added a quick PR on updating. Okay, the cluster inventory API concept is still good, but the cluster profile, it's our first major API into this repo. So please take a look at that as well if you're interested. So since the last community meeting, we we decide, hey, we want to have a CRD implementation up on the cluster inventory API repo as soon as possible. So the consumers can sort of let me just to be polite. Okay, so we can so the consumer can start, or experimenters can start consuming it, and then there are a bunch of really healthy, great discussions, and then we talk about what should be, what should a condition be, is it required field, optional fields, and then there's a whole bunch of other discussion, and I would say most of the topics we are able to come to a consensus and agreement on, and the big one is here, the cluster scope versus namespace scope, which is what we heavily debated in the last community meetings as well. Let me just go here. Okay, so a lot of folks have chimed in on this document, and I want to thank you all for going into this document and putting your feedbacks. And in conclusion, for now, before we even start the discussion, we have not settled on if we should use cluster scope or namespace scope yet. So majority of the feedback is namespace scope is very, as we all know, is very useful for RBAC purposes, but we really need to define is this cluster profile API, is it going to be used in one or more multiple inventories, and that sort of tie to what we discuss is inventory is a cluster set, and then a cluster set should be a namespace, and then that's how you can have that multiple inventories in a single hub cluster. So if we say, you can only have one inventories on a hub cluster or one cluster set in a hub cluster, then of course it's easier to say, let's just go with cluster scope for now. So we added Q Zhang, the original author of this document. He added this section. So I just want to go over specifically this section first, and we kind of want to sort of define that, do we really want to do multiple inventories in a single hub cluster? So in this doc sort of suggests, if it's namespace scope, multiple namespace means multiple inventories. So the question really is, how do we really enforce it? Like, let's say we want to do namespace scope. How do we sort of enforce the user go like, this namespace represent one cluster set, and then the other namespace represent another cluster set, and it seems like, cluster profile as a member of that inventory, it's hard to have that enforcement. And I kind of said a lot right now, so I want to take a break and let others chime in first. So the first real question is, should this be in a single hub cluster, should there be multiple inventories or just one?
So if nobody's going to speak, I will just remind that the last time we tried a cluster registry project, the thing that caused so much consternation was the demand that we allow multiple inventories in a single server, which is why it ended up namespace. So I do feel a little bit like Groundhog's Day.
I want to add to that to me, it's not should there be one or multiple. That's not really the question. It's, is there a good reason to say there must never be more than one? because you can always have one, right? If we support n, one is a valid value of n. But by making this statement, we're not saying whether there should be one or multiple. We're saying we have a good reason, I hope, that you should never be allowed to have more than one inventory in a single cluster. And I'm having trouble seeing a good reason not to give that option. Like I know we have some pros and cons listed later in this doc, you know, about folks not necessarily having to care, like about namespaces as one motivator. That seems like slight ease of use, but there's a great namespace for I don't care about namespaces. It's called default. We all love when people use it, but Tim, I thought you'd do that. But to me, this is more, we're adding a restriction. Do we have a good reason to add that restriction? And that's the angle I'd come at this from.
No, I think that's a really fair point. Yeah, there. You know, besides obviously the simplification, you know, if you can say each hub cluster can only have one inventory, then yeah, let me just close that for that. Yep, then it should be cluster scope. But yeah, there's no real reason why, you know, we should limit it to a single inventory. Ryan, are you in the call? Do you want to chime in?
Yeah. I have my hand raised. I don't know if that's you can see that.
Yeah, I was going to call on Ryan. Ryan's been patiently waiting.
I think Mike has a question in the chat, but similarly, do we actually have a definition of inventory? Is that same as cluster set? Do we assume namespace sameness within a inventory? Have we ever defined what is a cluster inventory? Or is there any consensus, or the community assume this is a cluster set?
So that's sort of the problem that we had in the beginning when we proposed the API. We ended up sort of proposing a member of the cluster inventory, which is cluster profile, and a set of cluster profile or a list of cluster profile is supposed to form that cluster inventory. But we never really discussed a cluster set is a cluster inventory. And now it sounds like, do we need to go back and make a cluster inventory API just to have that full on definition instead of relying on, oh, these are a whole bunch of members and these members belongs to this cluster set. This is how it forms that particular cluster inventory. Please go ahead.
I don't think we need necessarily an API. I think we need a statement. Like if we think it should be one-to-one, we write that in the cap. If it's something else, then we might need an API. And if it's something else, to me, that seems a little scary. A lot of scope creep, but I'll let others chime in with thoughts.
Yeah, the reason I ask this is I think most people have this cluster set as an inventory assumption, or at least I had this mental model there. And if we have that, then the namespace sameness, if we put in multiple inventories into one hub cluster, and then the namespace sameness seems to be, I don't know how do we do that then? It's getting difficult, at least for me to think through these when we start to do if it combined with MCS and other things. I don't know if that's if we want to. I'm not saying we don't want to support that, but if we do, we probably want to also think through a little bit of what does that mean when we have multiple quote unquote inventories into one control plane. It may, as Mike says, it will complicate things. if we haven't thought through, at least I haven't thought through how complicated that would be with all the cases.
And I don't think we need to go back or anything. I just think that we should be explicit about how these concepts relate to each other.
Yeah, I think the key is if two things, right? If we all agree this is a cluster set or not, I don't know. If it is, then what does that mean when we have multiple cluster set in one place? If not, it's a different story. I don't know if there are other definitions of cluster inventory. What constitutes a cluster inventory?
And if you have namespace scoped, like a set of cluster profiles in one namespace is one cluster set, and
yeah,
like that,
yeah,
that's a totally reasonable thing. You can have a single cluster profile in its own namespace, as many namespaces as you want like that. If you have things that should not have any like sameness relationship to each other, like a namespace model does support that.
Exactly. That's the thing. Like again, my mental model is if a single cluster inventory is a cluster set, and then we have namespaces. The most natural is what you described, right? Every cluster set is in that namespace. However, our CAP never defined all of that. That would make sense to me. But if we don't define that and just make it namespaced, then people could use it whatever way they could. That may interfere, may not lead to the proper interoperability that we designed for, right? This is supposed to design for interoperability. So if one provider just crab everything into one namespace or randomly distribute other provider does something, then it may reduce the interoperability of that API.
So
Tim?
For lack of better API machinery, we've got the Kubernetes API server, right? And I think that's what we're really focused on here. It probably is not the structure that we would want to set up for something like this, which feels more collection-ish. Like we would want resources and sub-resources and sub-resources. We don't have that, so we have to use what we've got. I think it's inevitable that whatever we define here, we then have to define a consumption model, right? How is a client going to use this? And what is the arity of the things that they are asking about? Is it one query to one cluster gives me a cluster set? Or is it n queries to n clusters gives me a cluster set, which I think is a reasonable thing. I know Mike in the doc you suggested that was weird, but I could see it coming from a strictly regional sort of operations point of view. Or is it n clusters times m namespaces, which feels really like pushing it to me, but we'll have to define what we expect consumers to do with it, because however we define that will bound how you use this API. If we provide all the flexibility, then we provide none of the opinion, which I think is not good. If we provide all of the opinion, then we provide none of the flexibility, which is probably also not good. But there's got to be an inflection point in there somewhere. I think Corentin's up next.
Yeah, I was curious if someone wanted to reply to that. Otherwise, it's kind of the same fashion. I was curious if the cluster set, and sorry, I'm not too familiar with cluster set, I guess. Do people use cluster set to represent the full list of cluster? And then maybe it's like it's all the cluster, and then the problem is the sameness because we assume that, and maybe that's the sameness we need to dial down. Or on the opposite, is the cluster set like the really enforced sameness, and people would want to compose multiple cluster sets together? And it's like, which one is the subset, which one is the full set, is where I'm maybe not fully clear, and which one would the cluster inventory target?
So I think I can directly answer that question. Cluster set is well defined in MCS API and KEPs already to be a set of multiple clusters which have an assumption of sameness such that like a service by a given name in a given namespace is assumed to be logically identical to a service by that same name in that same named namespace in another cluster within the cluster set. We do not have an explicit definition of what an inventory is. An inventory could map to the list of clusters within the cluster set. It could also be, like you're talking about, like a level above that of a list of clusters which may belong to either one cluster set or another. And you're basically, in terms of like thinking of the API, we have namespace scoped cluster profiles, you could either query the hub cluster and get a single inventory, which is a list of cluster profiles that belong to different cluster sets, or you could get a list of cluster inventories which are namespace scoped. That's the relationship that we do not have defined currently, is how does the inventory, which is like not a strong concept we have yet, map to cluster set. And I think either of those models works. It's just a question of how we want to think about this relationships. Jack and then Tim, I think.
Just a dumb question for your consideration. What is a cluster set in the context of this conversation? It's not clear to me why a cluster set and an inventory would be wielded as two distinct terms.
So cluster set is an existing well-defined term, and I can go dig up the CEP that defines it.
I see.
So
It's
I
what it
admit
says. The collection of clusters.
it's a collection
So
of
I guess-
clusters under common administration that are intended to interoperate in a particular pattern, specifically this pattern of assuming namespace sameness. And there are some related efforts like the About API, which says there is a well-known cluster property object in clusters, which says which cluster set it is a member of. Given that it's well known, it means it is a single thing. You cannot be a member of multiple cluster sets. That's not really well spec'd out, but it is a side effect of that specification. So I admit that I came to this whole conversation assuming that an inventory was equivalent to a cluster set. Cluster set being sort of a vague term, and inventory being an API name. That doesn't have to be true. And like I said, I sort of understand that there could be a model where one cluster set was actually multiple inventories. But I would push back against the idea that it's a large N number of inventories. I think it's a small N number of inventories, like regional, not per cluster. Because if I, as a client, and going back to the consumption model, as a client, if I want to enumerate all the clusters in my cluster set, I have to have a list of API servers to target and namespaces to query optionally. If the namespaces are one-to-one with clusters, then I already know my cluster set by definition of knowing which namespaces to query. But if I know my cluster set spans US East, US West, and Europe East, then I can go ask those three and get a full list of clusters, right? So in my mind, it's like cluster set could be order hundreds or thousands of clusters, and inventories would be, 3 to 10 inventories would comprise a cluster set on that order of magnitude. I totally lost my train of thought. Oh, I wanted to go back. Ryan, I think it was, you mentioned something about namespace sameness being a problem, but I'm not understanding what the problem is.
I think it's because of the mental model. I think in your mental model, cluster set can have multiple inventories. The other way around is one inventory can have multiple cluster set. That's where the names space sameness could be a problem, because now you have import, then it's in the same control plane, but it's only a subset of the clusters have that namespace sameness.
Right. So I have not yet heard a use case that demands one inventory be multiple cluster sets.
Yeah.
And I've offered the RBAC problem as a, like, we should just not do this because RBAC does not describe that well. You can't RBAC on properties of a resource. So I would say we should just take that I would like to propose that we take that off the table.
Yeah. So now I'm trying to drive a consensus, right? And I actually don't have super strong opinion anyway. So sounds like we now have two options. One is one cluster set has only one inventory and one on one, just one hub cluster, one cluster inventory, and one cluster set. That's all equivalent. Or I think Tim is proposing one hub cluster is one subset, one cluster set, but it could have multiple inventory. Although it's still not very clear to me what is the definition of inventory. But it's that one cluster set have multiple inventories. Each have I actually still don't know. For Tim's case, it's group by region. I can think of group by like protest, staging, blah blah. Either way sounds okay to me. But hopefully we can have some consensus. We can spell that out, flesh it out, and pros and cons, and then somehow get to this model.
I don't know that I would think of like those groupings as unless they were really like there's nothing stopping a cluster set from spanning multiple regions, for example, right?
Yeah,
I would think that if you want to group by characteristics, you wouldn't create multiple cluster sets and try to inventory them together. You would have one big cluster set, you have an inventory over that cluster set, and then you would use labels. So you can do arbitrary filtering. I'm like I can see why you might want I can definitely see reasons why you might want a hub cluster to have multiple inventories of multiple cluster sets. If you want to create links between the two or do that, I'm having trouble with why we'd need inventory to be smaller than a cluster set.
Huh. Okay, so now we have a model that inventory has multiple cluster sets, inventory equal to one cluster set, or one cluster set have multiple inventory. So we have both ways.
Well, to play off Jeremy's statement earlier, one is a valid value of n. So if we said, again, I'm leaning into my own mental model here, so please argue with me. A cluster set is one or more distinct inventories, where an inventory is defined as a cluster API server target and a namespace name. Now, if I want a global cluster set, I just want to do it as a global control plane, I have one. One is a value of n. If I want to do strictly regional, I can do 3 regions or 5 regions, but I probably don't want to do 100 regions, right? Even 100 maybe is plausible. I don't want to do one per cluster. And again, I will say we should just take the multiple cluster sets in one inventory off the table. I think that is a dead end. And if you want to slice that up by dev, test, prod instead of regions, that is a valid slicing, although there are other considerations I think you might want to think about there, but it's valid.
I want to just articulate the like multiple cluster sets in one inventory thing a little bit. I think that we don't actually have to like. I think it depends on how you define an inventory, and we're not necessarily defining it strictly. I'm thinking of an inventory as basically a list of cluster profiles. That list could be across all namespaces, which like kind of gets you the multiple cluster sets in a single inventory thing, if inventory is like an abstract concept rather than like a concrete thing. If you're requesting a list of the cluster profiles within a single namespace, and those are all assumed to be of a single cluster set, I think that works, and I think that that's fine.
Isn't that kind of implying it should be cluster scope? So you have a list of unique cluster profiles, which forms an inventory, and then you have a bunch of cluster set that somehow maps, pick and chooses the inventory it wants.
I think I don't think that works. Sorry, go Tim. Is that you talking?
Well, since you invited me, Are we trying to define this as an opinionated API with a related or known relationship to cluster set? Or are we saying this is just a way you list clusters? It's an API that is very generic and carries very little meaning to it, and any meaning you ascribe to it is, on your own. I think that makes a big difference. If it's just a list of clusters and you can use labels to denote anything you want on those labels, that's cool. There are some things that don't work well, like you can't do access control within a single collection because of Kubernetes. If that's okay with you, hey, go nuts. Like, who am I to stop you? The consumption model of something like cluster set, I think, is going to be critical for multi-cluster features to be built. So the more generic we make this API, the more the opinion just shifts to another layer, right? If it's valuable to people to have a cluster inventory that is all of their clusters across all of their environments, across all of their clouds, and they want to put that somewhere, okay, that doesn't really represent a cluster set. And so you wouldn't point your multi-cluster deployment controller or your network controller at that, because that is multiple cluster sets. But you could have a label that says, this is my prod cluster set and this is my test cluster set, and now you have a consumption model. So I guess how generic or how opinionated do we want this to be? I was assuming fairly opinionated, but I could well be wrong.
Ryan?
Just to answer Tim's question, originally, I think two things. One is when we define the inventory, because that project starts from multiple multi-cluster projects. We all have this list of clusters, and at that time, that list, just to give you some background, at that time, that list, that's the reason we didn't put too much effort into define what is an inventory, was because that's basically in all of our projects, each list is what this control plane. We all have this cup cluster, right? So that's control plane can control. So we don't really have a concept whether it is a if actually in all our projects, Mike, you can correct me. I think in all our projects, each hub contains this inventory, but when we apply MCS, that just implies that this is a single cluster set. We assume cluster set namespace sameness on that hub cluster. So inventory at that time was implicitly, I think we all implemented one way or other some kind of MCS, was implicitly a single cluster set. That's why we never really thought too much on that. But going back to your second question, whether it should be opinionated, to me, either way is fine, but the end goal is the consumption model plus this has to be opinionated. Otherwise it's useless. Nobody can use it. Right? We either have to define here opinionated way here, or we have to define a opinionated consumption way. So that, as I mentioned, the interoperability is the reason we have this. Otherwise, without that, then everybody just does their own thing. Then doesn't, it has, at least to me, has much less value. But which way is better is something at least I haven't thought through yet, because we haven't got to the consumption model yet. Currently, my mental model is this is the how we lay out here is going to be the consumption model. We largely define the consumption model. I never thought, and I didn't think through that we can make this less opinionated and then make the consumption model define more a concrete consumption model. But that's something I haven't thought through. That's it. Yeah.
So I think that we can actually have both things. I think that, like, to Ryan and Tim's point, that we do need to be prescriptive to an extent and define the consumption model. And I think that namespaced CRDs lend you to both, like, explicitly defining all cluster profiles within a given namespace are assumed to be part of the same cluster set. If your use case is global and that's the default namespace and that's where you stick all of them, like, that works fine. If your use case does not have sameness and you want to stick them in different namespaces, like, that also works. And if you are like a workload placement thing that needs a regional list to schedule across, you can query cluster profiles across the whole hub, rather than only querying a specific namespace. And I think that actually works too. So yeah, I think that we do need to define this explicitly and keep the consumption model in mind. And I've basically been pulled around to namespace despite starting on the opposite place, because I think that it fits with the mental model that at least a few projects have. It also allows kind of the the non-sameness model is also possible with that, and you can group by RBAC within your cluster set if that's your use case as well. And I'll hand it over to Corentin.
I think you lost me just at the end on group by RBAC, but otherwise, I think I agree with your summary here, where if when you list for a namespace and then you get the all clusters are in the same cluster set. I think that makes sense. That way they're all similar. At least for sameness, they will participate in the same. The namespaces correspond to another, and all that you can do. And if you wanted to cover more cluster sets because you're doing some other arcing things, then you could go multiple namespaces and go a little bit more wild. But by default, you're on a good grouping, and I think that works out. Yeah, I mean that seems to confirm that to me.
So Ryan, you said, I think what I was really starting to think more strongly, which is there's an opinion needed somewhere, or at least this is my interpretation of what you said, Ryan. There's an opinion that we need somewhere. We either provide it here or we provide it at a layer above. I don't really see why we wouldn't provide it here. This feels like, it is a Kubernetes API defined by the Kubernetes community to serve Kubernetes problems. We have a definition of cluster set. This feels like the formalization of that into an API. I don't see why we would make this not align directly to cluster set.
Yeah, the question is, we have three-way relation, right? Inventory bigger than cluster set, equal to cluster set, subset of cluster set. That, I think, if we define that, I think it's lots of questions can be answered.
So I think, again, one is a value of n, so the last two are equivalent. And the first one, if I interpreted it correctly, inventory larger than cluster set. Yes, I think inventory larger than cluster set should just be don't do that. That's not what it's for.
Okay. Let's see if we can get this consensus. I'm fine with that, because initially we didn't have inventory bigger than cluster set anyway. But actually, I have a kind of procedural question. How can we get to a conclusion here? What's the normal way to get to a conclusion here?
I mean, who's actually writing the cap? Whose fingers are on that keyboard?
Oh, a cap.
I can write a section in the existing doc of these models, and I think that the namespace model supports all of them, even if one of them is a bad idea. And I'm happy to write that up.
I think that would be great, and we can say this is a magnet. If somebody has really strong counter evidence, this is where you attach a comment, please.
Yeah. Just to be clear, so the cap will say what? Say all three options, or have one option and then people chime in, and then what's the?
I think so. So yeah, I want to suggest that we move forward with the namespace model. Describe the relationship between a list of cluster profiles in namespaces and how those relate to cluster set membership, and have that well defined as part of this. And then also to say, if you have a need to get all cluster profiles in a hub, here's how you can do it. Here's probably why you shouldn't do that.
I'm not too clear exactly. But going back to my question, so with a cap, how do we solve get to consensus using a cap? We just comment, and then finally merge some version. Is that the?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the SIG leads are the ones who approve caps. I mean, I'm happy to participate from an API reviewer point of view, but that's supposed to be a little bit arm's length from the actual semantics of the design. So I'll try to wear both hats, but only one at a time. So, you know, who are the SIG leads now? Jeremy, and I don't know if Paul is still active or not.
No,
I think Paul stepped down. I'm not sure if Stephen Kidd is still a lead or not, or is a lead or not.
Okay. Whoever the official SIG leads are, or want to be, or will be, can make the ultimate decision about what we're pushing ahead with. I haven't heard anybody say, "No, you fools, you're doing the wrong thing." Here, this is a small group, so I think we write it in the KEP, we broadcast it, we let people know that this is actually a really important design decision that we are taking, and we're expressing an opinion here, and the KEP is the opportunity to argue with that opinion.
And that's really where I want to make sure this gets in front of the projects that are going to be adopting and consuming this, to make sure that what we're suggesting is going to work for them.
Exactly. Because ultimately, if we don't solve the problems for the projects that are building the actual utility here, then we've totally failed.
Yeah, I talked to the multi-queue people just yesterday. Yeah, well, they said same thing. They want to see our proposal, and basically they say they want to see our proposal, and if it works, then we will go to their batch work group to propose integrate a cluster inventory into their project.
Okay, great.
Just to be clear, I think the cap, because I also agree with Tim that the cap should be more of a conceptual instead of implementation details. So to me, the cap really, one thing I think we miss is the definition between the relation between inventory and the cluster set. Again, 3 cases. Do we present 3, or we present one opinionated one and then ask people to comment?
So I think I can chime in on that. I think Mike, instead of, or you can do both. Instead of creating a document, could you also make the PR on the cap itself? And that's where, you know, everyone can chime in, and then we finally get approved, and then it'll be merged into cap, and then it's well defined and something we all agreed on. Regarding the CRD implementation, I think based on the discussion today, it seems like we're picking the namespace scope. So that's so the CRD implementation. Okay, Ryan, please go ahead. It seems
I think
we want to leave a little bit of time for the original topic. I feel like we took 45 minutes. Is kind of unfair to Arthur, who had a mic problem.
Yeah, so I think the cap discussion, when my mental model is, as soon as we have this clear definition between the cluster set and the inventory relations, then the rest is a lot easier to solve. We are not too clear. At least I don't know if we have a consensus here yet. If we do, we have a cap, then the rest, if it's a namespace or cluster scope, or how does the implementation work, should be solved when we get a cap merged. That's my mental model.
Tim?
So I feel like the name cluster inventory was chosen to avoid saying cluster set. Like, if we think that these things align strongly, should we just say it? There's no API object named cluster inventory, right? But like, maybe the API group that ultimately comes out of this should be clusterset.k8s.io or something like that.
If we at the end the cap, as I said, if it's a one-on-one relation, then sounds yes, but sounds like it's not one-on-one, right? It sounds like we have one too many.
I think even if it's one to many, it's still a cluster set. It's a piece of a cluster set, but it is aligned to a cluster set.
It's like
so
sub-cluster set.
From an API reviewer point of view, I think that would add clarity that this is intended to align to a cluster set. And we can document that there's a sort of singular model and there's a like fragmented model, and consumers can choose whichever one they want, but here are the considerations between those two. And in the alternatives considered, we thought about having one inventory with multiple sets, but it turned out that that was just complicated, and we decided to not take that opinion. Like, we have an alternatives considered section. We should totally use it to make sure we don't re-adjudicate this one more time.
Sounds good.
So sorry, I'm gonna cut off here. Jeremy's gone, but let's move it to the cap and especially the cap, and then fit that into the PR for the CRD. And I think we can move to the next topic if everyone's okay.
Sounds good. Can we just make sure the doc that we want this in is linked in the notes? That's all.
And Mike, you're taking the cap.
Yep. Yeah. I'll write out the section for this and the different use cases. Yeah. And
Awesome.
I think I have a concrete proposal that can work.
Awesome. Arthur, are you still there?
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. So totally other topic on my side. Well, not totally, but I was reflecting a bit on the MCS API conflict resolution, and for context, currently it takes the oldest service export and takes what is exported there. So, for instance, if a service is headless or not, and the session affinity. And I was wondering that, well, this is kind of a global switch. So like the oldest rules rule them all. So I was wondering that if you export a service, you already know, well, what the local service should be like. So maybe we could take the, for instance, headlessness of the local service and also applies that to the service import. So for instance, I don't know if all this service is not headless, but in your local cluster, you are exporting headless services. Maybe the
are you sharing screen?
Also headless. No,
Sorry,
I'm not sharing.
It's a little bit hard to understand. Do you have anything to share? Do you have a doc or something to some illustration to?
Well, not really.
Okay.
I mean, it's only the cap that says like one sentence that says all this service export wins the conflict, and it should take that from anything.
So the rationale for that is not every cluster actually exports every service. So
Yeah.
for a cluster that doesn't have an export for service X,
Mhm.
and the clusters that are exporting it have divergent definitions of that service, what does the import look like?
Mhm.
Right. So we did. I remember this conversation pretty clearly. Actually, we talked about, oh, we'll just use whatever the local cluster thinks it is, except what if it doesn't? What, like, I don't. It feels weird to have it be very context dependent how the service is going to be consumed, and then have a corner case that is, and then you get random or you get some other opinionated position that is different from everybody else for those other cases. It is a weird sort of awful corner case, right? Another option could really here be just don't, like, oh, sorry, you have divergent exports. You don't get to export this anymore. But that feels like an attack vector where, you know, a cluster gets compromised or something, and somebody creates a service export and disrupts traffic going on between other clusters. So what we ended up with here was sort of the least worst attack and the most likely to be correct, what we thought. But I think in that regard, like, if there are better options, I would love to hear them.
Yeah, I see. I was also in the middle of, is this less or more confusing? Because, well, I mean, if you have a local service, you could say, oh, my global service should be lookalike, but also it's not, well, it's also a corner case. So, yeah. But I guess it's fine if this is like an opinionated thing to do that. Brian, you had a point.
I'm just curious. In the original design, my first reaction for those conflict resolution would be like majority rule. Why didn't we do a majority instead of oldest? Because in distributed computing, oldest time is kind of hard to define. You don't know which one is the old one. The time is not absolute.
That's a fair point, though Kubernetes, despite knowing that time is a fiction, relies on timestamps all over the place for adjudication. So in this regard, we look at the creation time of that object, and we say, look, we already trust that there's some amount of synchronization on time, and ultimately it doesn't really matter which one you choose as long as you don't flap and choose one and then choose a different one and then choose a different one and then choose a different one. So oldest is guaranteed to be stable, given that those timestamps can't change, right? They're immutable properties of the resources. We thought about doing newest, which actually we do for other places where we say, oh, the newest definition wins because you're maybe in the middle of a rolling update, so we'll take the newest thing. But again, that makes it an attack vector here, where some new cluster some cluster could be compromised and then change the definition of it. Like imagine an attack on your control plane. I'm going to change it from headless to non-headless to headless to non-headless and go back and forth as fast as I can. Your control plane is going to churn through propagating information across your network. That's a bad thing. Oldest, well, sorry, you can't change which one's oldest except by making the oldest one go away.
What about the majority one?
That is an option. I don't think we consider that very heavily because I don't really even remember because. It seems like it could be plausible. I'd have to think more about why it would be better or worse.
Yeah, because that's the first thing coming to my mind when we have an election. It's always majority, right? Have conflict, we have majority. So, okay, maybe we can think through that. That something feels like, Arthur, are you interested in think through a little bit more on that? Do you have any other proposals, like resolve the conflict?
Well, I'm not sure because also the service import is auto-created, so we would have to somehow does it on the service export, and it sounds complicated, basically, because sorry.
There's already some level of control plane that is looking at the union of all of those service exports to make a decision, right? It has to decide, what am I going to write for all of the service imports? So having it do I've got 3 of those and 2 headless and 3 cluster full or IP full, then I'll go with IP. Doesn't seem worse. It's a little less predictable, I think, but it does have the advantage of not relying on time, unless you end up with a split vote, in which case you have to have a fallback, and time seems like the obvious thing to do there.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's more complicated for no real win. I don't know. I'm not super attached to the decision that was made in the past. It seemed like a least worst option. But if there's a better option that's obviously better, then I would be okay with that. Or honestly, since it's a corner case, you could just make it a control plane decision. Like, let the control plane decide how it wants to decide based on what information it has.
Because I guess if we want to be tunable somehow by the user, it would need to be like a global setting on the on the controller that implement MCS API, because if we need to add the settings on all the service export and stuff, and somehow getting to other cluster and reconcile that, it sounds kind of awful.
Yeah. Well, what MCS as a design was trying to avoid was defining anything global and saying there exists a control plane that is outside the scope of that particular specification. So if the control plane wants to have a knob that says use time as the tiebreaker, that seems reasonable. I'm not sure it's super valuable to make it a knob, and more knobs is always less better. So, like, again, I would say if there's a demonstrable reason for changing it, awesome, let's do it. If there's no reason, we're just thinking about it, then we should consider whether change is worth it.
Yeah, well, my point was more on maybe have the user less confused about this decision so that we can take the local, but it can be the other way around, like it can be more confusing. So I mean, yeah, there is not really good choice.
If you feel strongly about it, propose a kept change, and then we can discuss a specific change here. I'm not against it. I just don't know what the right answer would be.
Well,
that cap is not GA yet, so now's the time.
I'm not too strongly going into one direction or another. It's just that ideas throwing around. And to me, when I read it, it was maybe more confusing, but I can see the other way around. That it's more confusing the way that I'm proposing.
Whichever
But,
way we end up, we
yeah.
should document it
Mhm.
better, so it's less confusing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess maybe I could write something in alternative notes so that it's clear in the cap. And if people say, "Oh, should be the actual way," please change it. Maybe I will do that, I guess.
That's a great answer.
Okay, cool. Sounds like a plan.
We have 3 more minutes. Does anyone want to take them or?
Yes,
Back to the cap. Oh, go for it. Awesome.
No, I just want to wrap up. I guess Ryan was going to say the same thing, anyways. To wrap up our conversation regarding the CRD implementation on the cluster profile. So the biggest topic we have there is namespace scope versus cluster scope, and that decision is now waiting on Mike. Gonna push the cap PR, and once that cap PR is merged, and then the CRD implementation will follow whatever the cap specify. Is that the understanding of everyone in this call, Ryan?
My understanding was that we're mostly settled on namespace, and what Mike was especially hammering is the relationship with regard to cluster set.
I'm not sure the namespace thing is fully settled yet. Although I'm not against it. But again, I feel like the relationship between the infantry, what is the infantry cluster versus the cluster set, most likely after we get that conclusion, the answer should be clear by then.
That's my hope, exactly. Yeah, better define that, and then it kind of falls out from there that the namespace model makes sense for the patterns that works with.
Great, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, and see you on the PR comments.
Thanks, y'all.
See y'all. Take
See you
care.
there.